Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Thomas Fetzer. I'm the head of the Department of International Relations here at CEU, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this afternoon's event, which is a joint event organized by our department and the CEU Press. And I'm very pleased to welcome Emily Bosniansky, the director of CEU Press, here with us. And we are here to discuss the book launch of a two-volume book just appeared with CEU Press on Ukraine's patronal democracy and the Russian invasion and Russia's imperial endeavor and the geopolitical consequences. And we are very lucky to have the two editors of both volumes with us. Here to my left, Bálint Magyar, and further to my left, Bálint Madlovics. And they are both currently fellows at the CEU's Democracy Institute in Budapest. We will first have a short presentation by one of the editors, and then we will follow up with comments by two guests, the first of whom is online. So I'm pleased to welcome Julia Kazdobina, who is the head of the Ukrainian Association for Security Studies, and who will deliver her comment online. And I'm pleased also on my right to welcome Alexander Etkind, excuse me, who is a professor at our Department of International Relations. We will have two comments, and then after that we will open the floor for comments and questions. So let me just say a few words about what I learned from the editors about the genesis of these two books, which originated in earlier work by Bálint Magyar and Bálint Madlovics on out of an earlier work on the conceptualization of the new Hungarian state as a mafia state into a comparative analysis of Central East European democracies and to rethink them. And in an earlier volume, both Bálint Magyar and Bálint Madlovics have addressed this theme, and this volume has appeared in 5 languages. I'm not sure I will be able to recount all the languages: English, Spanish, Romanian, Russian, and Hungarian, not to forget. Exactly. So maybe that was the first, actually. No, that was English was the first. Okay, excellent. So that is the background, and with the onset of the full-scale invasion, basically these two volumes are, if I understand well, an attempt to apply this framework or this earlier this earlier research to the current situation and try to understand how the war might reshape these patterns. And so without further ado, I give the floor to Bálint Madlovics to give us a short summary of the main arguments of the book, and then we move.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. And before I start presenting just very briefly what the contents of these two volumes are, let me start by a special thanks to CEU Press. First of all, for bringing this event together, but even more so for making this publication happen in such a rapid manner. So it took only 13 months from the idea of having these two volumes to have them published. In 13 months, we brought together over 30 authors. We had their chapters written, we edited the chapters, we talked them over with the authors. Then the CEU Press had the book reviewed, had it edited, typeset, and published in an open access format. All of it in 13 minutes. So this was a really very rapid process, which we are very, very grateful for, especially because this is a topic which is about very much a moving subject. This is really something that is changing all the time, even though in these two volumes, Ukraine's patronal democracy and the Russian invasion, and Russia's imperial endeavor and its geopolitical consequences, we are not talking about what is happening on the battlefield. We know that if we would write about that, that would become obsolete the day it comes out. Rather, we wanted to focus on the structural consequences. The structural consequences, how the war is reshaping the political economic system and the society of these two countries, and how the geopolitical structure is being reformed by the Russia-Ukraine war. This is what's explored by over 30 authors, more than half of them being Ukrainian scholars. They cover a wide range of topics. The two volumes cover politics, the political system, they cover economy, they cover social structure, the national identity of Ukraine, and also the responses of various international actors and how the geopolitical sphere is being reshaped. But what binds these over 30 authors together is a common theoretical foundation, a common conceptual framework. And that is the conceptual framework that, as it was mentioned in the introduction, had been developed by Bálint, Magyar, and I before these two volumes were brought together. So I will start by introducing that conceptual framework, by our general approach to post-communist regimes, and after which I will be talking about Russia and Ukraine. So after the regime change, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were two main illusions about the region. One is the linear progress toward liberal democracies, and the other that any regime can be built on any kind of ruins of communist dictatorship. So the basic idea was that there is a royal road towards which all of these countries are going. In the 1990s, this was the presumption of so-called transitology. Transitology, as the main branch or the mainstream of political science back then, had a teleological assumption that even though these countries are facing problems, they are underway. And they might face these problems and will eventually become Western-type liberal democracies. In over 10 years, most people realized that this was not the case, and what they were looking at, maybe they were not transitional systems, but terminal stations. This was the point when in the mainstream, transitology was replaced by hybridology. Hybridology is now the mainstream comparative regime theory. And this is the idea of hybrid regimes. They're thinking in a democracy-dictatorship axis with Western-type liberal democracy on one end, classical dictatorship on the other end, and between the two, there's a wide gray zone of various non-democracies, non-dictatorships, but somewhere in between, like electoral authoritarianism, competitive authoritarianism, hegemonic authoritarianism, and so on. Now, we pose a challenge to this mainstream comparative paradigm. Our challenge is based on two things. One is that this hybridology is still focusing mainly on the political institutional setting. And the second is that it is still using the language of liberal democracies when it comes to describing post-communist regimes. It is still talking about parties, governments, politicians, entrepreneurs, all of these concepts that were developed for liberal democratic contexts. And if they are used in post-communist context, immediately you are bringing in implicit assumptions. You're bringing with them such hidden axioms that are distorting your perception, even unknowingly. We can identify three such axioms that need to be dissolved if we want to analyze post-communist regimes. The first one is that the separation of spheres of social action, political, economic, and communal, is completed, that these spheres have autonomy vis-a-vis each other, and the relationship between them is transparent, formalized, and regulated. Now, what if this is not the case? What if we have certain actors who seem to be entrepreneurs, but in fact, to their formal economic power, they also have informal political power. These are the oligarchs. And you also have actors who look like politicians, but in fact, to their former political power, they also have informal economic power. These we call oligarchs. So what if you have such kind of actors? Then to be able to make sense of them, you have to give up this first axiom. The second axiom is that the de jure position of persons and institutions coincides with their de facto position. So here we return once again to the language. If you say entrepreneur, for example, or if you identify someone in Ukraine or Russia as a capitalist, then immediately you bring in some assumptions like, for example, that a capitalist can use his capital by his capitalist motives, that he can actually use his property, he can dispose over his company, he can sell it, he can expand it, whatever, within the legal limits. Now, what if this is not the case? What if there are people who do not have autonomy over their legal ownership rights, but rather they are just the frontman of someone who is the actual owner of that piece of property? So you have to give up the second axiom as well. The third one is that the state is an actor pursuing the common good. And even if there are public policy mistakes or corruption cases, those are just deviances. That is not something that the state actually wants. It's something the state actually tries to eliminate. Now, once again, what if this is not the case? What if there are states which pursue not by per definitionem public interest, but per definitionem private interest. What if you have states where corruption is not a deviance? It is not something that's done in a bottom-up manner by the bureaucracy, private actors, and the oligarchs capturing the state, but rather what is made a centralized and monopolized state function. Now, if you give up these three axioms, you reach the phenomenon of patronalism. And this is the key distinctive phenomenon of post-communist regimes. We define patronalism as a form of informality, a form of informal relationship between political and economic actors, between political, economic, and social actors, institutions, and structures. It is a special type of informality, namely a hierarchical form of informality. It means that decisions are taken out from the formal institutions. In the case of Ukraine, what seems to be the competition of parties was, for a very long time after the country became independent, in fact, the competition of informal patron-client network. The decisions were not made by the parties, within the parties as autonomous bodies. Rather, they were made in informal circles by some people who had formal positions, some people, like the oligarchs, who did not have formal power positions. They made the decisions, and they only used the parties to channel their informal agendas to the formal realm of politics. So that's the first one. The second one is that they can, in patronal regimes, these actors can turn regulations from discretional to normative. From normative to discretion. This means, for example, in the case of Russia, if you think about Putin's informal patronal network, which is what we call a single pyramid patronal network, a hierarchy with Putin on top as a chief patron of that network, this means that he can give targeted rewards and punishments. Using state power, he can make the actions of the state custom-tailored to certain people. He can provide protection and benefits to the insiders of his network, and he can attack those who are outsiders of those who are prey outside the network. This is the second one. The third one is that authorization or decision-making is not done by collective or corporate bodies, but by persons, mainly the chief patron and those who are authorized by him, the sub-patrons. And finally, the hierarchy in such a system is not based on bureaucratic institutional chains like it was in the communist dictatorship with the party hierarchy. No, in an informal patronal network, there is no formal membership, but informal ties between the people, clientelist personal chains. Now, the more a country is characterized or dominated by patronal structures, the more patronal that regime will be, as opposed to a non-patronal system. This leads us to expand the democracy dictatorship axis, to not be satisfied with only focusing on the political institutional setting, but we need to double. We need to double the three main categories: democracy, autocracy, and dictatorship. We have two democracies, liberal democracy and patronal democracy. As you can see, Ukraine, as well as several other post-communist regimes, are situated within this triangle around patronal democracy. And in patronal democracy, what seems to be party competition is in fact the competition of these informal patron-client networks. Those are called by Ukrainian scholars also in the book, political economic clans. Now, there are multiple clans in a patronal democracy which are competing. That's a multi-pyramid patronal network. In an autocracy, a patronal autocracy like Russia, that is a single pyramid network. There is only one pyramid, and that subjugates, eliminates, or marginalizes all the other opponents. That is opposed to a conservative autocracy, where only the political sphere is monopolized, only that is going on is subject to autocratization, but the economy is practically left alone, like Poland was going in that direction. And we have these two forms of dictatorship, the classical communist dictatorship and what we call market exploiting dictatorship. Now, in this triangle, we can present several regime trajectories, including the trajectory of Ukraine. So we can actually visualize how Ukraine developed, starting from communist dictatorship, starting from being part of the Soviet Union, then becoming independent in 1991, and in what direction it went after the regime change. What we can see is that the country never became a liberal democracy. Rather, it became a patronal democracy. And after it became a patronal democracy, we can see a pendulum-like movement going back and forth between patronal democracy and patronal autocracy. There were always autocratic attempts to change the patronal democracy to a patronal autocracy, but these attempts, mainly by Kuchma and Yanukovych, were repelled by the color revolutions, by the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution, or as the Ukrainians call it, the Revolution of Dignity. Now, this is what creates what we call regime cycles. However, although these regime cycles, these color revolutions prevented the Ukrainian regime from becoming an autocracy, they also didn't make it a liberal democracy, only returned it to patronal democracy. So this is why the regime cycles came about. To understand this, to understand why the country couldn't become an autocracy, but also couldn't become a liberal democracy, to understand that we need to think a little bit more about the concept of patronal democracy. Now, as I already mentioned, in a patronal democracy, there are various parties competing against each other with various ideological labels, some of them left-wing, some of them right-wing, and so on. But in fact, those are cover ideologies. What is the true thing is that behind each party, there is an informal patron-client network with twin motives. And the twin motive is power concentration and wealth accumulation. They want to use the parties, and they use the parties to maximize their power and to have access to state resources. Now, if such actors populate the political regime, then if any of them gets into power, it will try to break down the system. Because any of them gets into power, it will want to become a monopolist of power, it will want to maximize its power, and it will want to crowd out all the other networks as well. So practically, all the networks want to eliminate the multi-pyramid system in favor of a single pyramid. All of them want to become dominant. All of them want to eliminate pluralism. This is why we say that in such a system, legitimacy challenge, unlike in a liberal democracy, is not an anomaly. It is the norm. In a patronal democracy, democracy is always in danger. And all the actors want to break it down. However, what we could see in the case of Ukraine is that it could not be broken down. And why? Because the ruling networks, even though they attempted it, the opposition networks were too strong. And also, there was a vibrant, free civil society. And they together could fight back and actually remove the ruling network from power. There were always autocratic attempts, but they could never reach the stage of a full autocratic breakthrough. And therefore, it could be changed back through electoral or extra-electoral means, by which, of course, I mean the color revolutions. Now, what is the problem here? Now, the problem here is the following. Western observers generally were very much optimistic about the color revolutions because they were thinking in the democracy-dictatorship axis. In the democracy-dictatorship axis, the color revolutions look like this. The former regime was closer to the dictatorial end, to the more repressive end, and now it's being replaced by something closer to the free end. Therefore, it can be only by definition, if you're thinking in that single axis, a liberal democracy. So everyone thought that after the color revolution, liberal democracy would come. Now, that didn't come in Ukraine. And why? Because under the surface of formal political competition, although the ruling network was defeated, the opposition networks remained. And when another opposition network came into power, it once again tried to break down the system. Then it was defeated again, and another one came, and that tried to break down the system again, going back and forth in a kind of circular motion. There was always democratic transformation, but no anti-patronal transformation. Everyone tried to break this multi-pyramid setting that you can see with patronal democracy, and transform it into this single pyramid, one patronal autocracy, but they were never successful and returned the whole system back to square one. Now, comparing Ukraine and Russia before the war, before the full-scale invasion of 2022, we can see movements which are almost the opposites of each other. In the case of Ukraine, after 2012, we can see practically the death of democracy. Practically what we can see is autocratic consolidation. So autocratic breakthrough had already happened by that time in Russia. So Putin could establish a single pyramid network after 2003, getting the supermajority and subjugating and neutralizing the oligarchs. But after 2012, he actually secured the monopolization of the political sphere and the patronalization of society. He could monopolize the political sphere by increasing state violence, and he could, using state power, transform more and more autonomous positions in society into patron-client dependencies. And if you do that, then you eliminate even the chances of any kind of opposition, effective opposition, emerging, because then there will be no autonomous resources against you. Therefore, Putin in this time achieved what we call the fatal combination for democracy, the fatal combination of monopolization of political institutions and patronization of social movements. On the other hand, in the case of Ukraine, what we see after the Euromaidan revolution is an anti-patronal attempt. First, after 2013, we can see a real mushrooming of various anti-corruption NGOs and watchdogs, and they actually took part very much, and this is described in the book there is a chapter by Oksana Hus in the first volume, describing all these NGOs, how they got more and more role in local and national governance, and how then their anti-patronal agenda was also elevated to the rank of central politics by the election of Zelensky. Zelensky is the first president of Ukraine, of post-communist Ukraine, who had no patronal network behind him. He is the first anti-patronal president, practically, and he had this strong anti-patronal agenda, for which he also started increasing presidential power already in this period. So in the case of Ukraine, we saw practically the opposite of what we saw in the case of Russia. In the case of Ukraine, after the Color Revolution, after the Revolution of Dignity, we saw an anti-patronal attempt, an attempt to break out of those regime cycles I was talking about. Practically what happens first is a real mushrooming of anti-corruption NGOs with increasing role in national and also local governance. The local governments also underwent a so-called decentralization reform in 2014. All of these are, by the way, described in the first volume. There are chapters by Oksana Hus, an Ukrainian author, also Alexander Fisun, another author, who describe all these processes and how they affected the Ukrainian regime already before the full-scale invasion to an anti-patronal effect. And all these anti-patronal agendas that were represented by mainly these civil society actors, it was elevated into the rank of central politics by the election of Zelensky. Zelensky was the first president of post-communist Ukraine who was not a patronal president, who did not have an informal patron-client network behind him. So together, the combination of social activism and Zelensky's exceptional legitimacy posed a challenge to the patronal element of Ukraine's patronal democracy. Now, at this point, before the full-scale invasion, it was really not clear which side was winning. It was really not clear which is the stronger side. Now, what do we see after the full-scale invasion starts? Well, in Russia, what we see is a movement towards dictatorship, a movement towards a more and more formalized repression, a stronger and more formalized repression with weakening civil society, weakening oligarchic side of the ruling elite. Whereas in Ukraine, what we see is also, on the one hand, the weakening of the oligarchs, but we also see the strengthening of anti-oligarchic, anti-patronal elements. On the one hand, we have weakening patronal element because the oligarchs are suffering losses. They're losing wealth, they're losing markets, they're losing assets, losing properties, also analyzed in the book. And on the other hand, we have Zelensky, who is centralizing power because of the war. The war goes into war mode, and as a almost necessary result of that, the whole state and whole state power becomes much, much more centralized. And he uses this power, among other things, to crack down on the oligarchs very, very strongly. So with this de-oligarchization, what we see is that Ukraine is really breaking out of these regime cycles, that there is an anti-patron transformation undergoing. However, there is a problem here. And the problem is, what is Zelensky doing right now? So this is what Russia's trajectory looked like, as opposed to Ukraine's trajectory. It did not have the pendulum-like movement, but actually going to patronal autocracy and now authoritarianship. Now this was achieved in the following way. Putin, back in the early 2000s, 2003, and afterwards, he centralized power and neutralized the oligarchs. Now what is Zelensky doing right now? He centralizes power and neutralizes the oligarchs. So, are they something similar? Is it true? I can also ask, is it true what I was telling you just a minute ago, that Zelensky is in fact carrying out an anti-patronal transformation and breaking down the patronal element? Or is he achieving something that none of his predecessors could do, to actually establish a single pyramid network, to actually break down the multi-pyramid competitive system that was, and moving the country toward an autocracy? Is this the future of Ukraine? Well, in this book, we try to analyze this question as well, and our answer, in a nutshell, is no. And the no is, or the why we have this answer, is mainly because Zelensky's single pyramid rule, his network is not a patronal network. He is not a patronal president. Still, he doesn't have an informal single pyramid patronal network. There are some similarities. There are some similarities to what we see in patronal autocracies like Russia or Central Asian countries or Hungary. Like, his network is also a pyramid-like hierarchy. There is personal loyalty of his clients. If you think about how he appoints certain people to leading positions like Yermak, his chief of staff, of course, there is personal loyalty. There is an increasing power of the president, decreasing power of the parliament. You can see all these in the case of Zelensky and also in the case of countries like Russia. However, there are four major dissimilarities, and those four major dissimilarities are precisely at the heart of being patronal or non-patronal. First, decisions are not moved out of formal institutions. As they are moved in an informal patronal network, they are moved to the patron's court. And then they use the parties to channel their agenda through formal realm of politics. No, here, decisions stay within the formal institutions and move to a formal body, the National Security Council. Then there are no discretionary rewards and punishments. There are no targeted rewards and punishments. Rather, what we see under Zelensky are normative anti-oligarchic measures which attack even that oligarch, Kolomoisky, who supported him in the beginning. Then there are no new oligarchs created under Zelensky. And what we also do not see is that even though some properties, some pieces of property are taken away from the oligarchs, there's nationalizations, but what we do not see is that Zelensky would give this to his clients. What we see in patronal autocracies, what we see in Russia, what we see in Hungary, is that there is nationalization and then targeted reprivatization to the clients of the single pyramid patronal network. This is what we call transit nationalization. And this is another thing we do not see in the case of Zelensky. So if I want to sum this up, there is no central-led corporate trading. There is no new oligarchic group. There are no new oligarchs created. And Zelensky himself is not becoming an oligarch. So if those three things are together, or rather the lack of those three things is together, that means that there is genuine change in Ukraine. And it means that Zelensky, in fact, is leading a bureaucratic network rather than an informal patronal network. The real question now, in terms of the political economic system of Ukraine, is whether there will be democratic transformation. There is an anti-patronal transformation ongoing, but will there be democratic transformation? If you think about it, this is the opposite kind of problem which Ukraine had before. Before, with the regime cycles, they always had democratic transformations, but never anti-patronal. Now, it seems that there is anti-patronal, but will there be democratic? Will Zelensky let go of this power? Will Zelensky reinstitute democracy after the war? Will the country move from patronal democracy and break out of regime cycles in the direction of liberal democracy, or will it go towards a non-patronal but still autocratic regime, a conservative democracy? In these two volumes, with over 30 authors, what we try to give a diagnosis, and we try to analyze the factors which might contribute to the country, including domestic factors and the geopolitical factors, which might contribute to Ukraine to becoming, from patronal democracy, a liberal democracy in the end. And thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bálint, for this excellent outline of 2 volumes, which is not an easy task to do in 20 minutes. Then let us make the transition to the first round, which would be for our 2 discussants to provide their comments. And so let's start with Julia Kazdobina, who joins us online. So I hope she can hear us and she could follow the presentation. So Julia, the floor is yours for your comment.
Good evening, and thank you very much for the invitation and for the presentation. I think indeed this was very interesting and a very useful approach, right, to introduce the 3rd category of patronal democracy, which I think explains a lot better the processes that were going on in Ukraine, and definitely explains it a lot better until the second revolution, the revolution of dignity. But when I was listening to the part about President Zelensky, I think at this point the picture becomes a lot more diverse and a lot more complicated, because when we get to President Poroshenko, although he did rely to a large extent on patronal networks, he was not able to completely ignore civil society, and actually his party included a lot of civil society activists on its party list, and they were able to get into the parliament, and they were people with like real agenda, and so the picture becomes really mixed. And then when Zelensky is elected, well, he does not really have his patronal network in terms of economic influence, but at the same time, he did not really have a party, and the party that the servant of the people, it was basically based on his charisma, and all these people, they were not independent players. They became the members of the parliament just because they joined the party and they were associated with Zelensky. And when Zelensky became president, when he started making appointments, he did not appoint people based on their professional qualities. He was appointing people based on his personal loyalty. So basically, when he got there, he was trying to build his own system the way a patronal leader would. And so basically, when we're looking at the way the situation developed, if there were no war, and this existential danger did not emerge, and if there was no pressure from both sides, from civil society and also from Western partners, for Ukraine to reform, we would not have seen the changes that we're seeing now. And I think the important thing that was happening under Zelensky is the change in the institutions. So when he came, he did not really respect all the institutional structures. He was trying to make decisions really fast, bypassing all the procedures, and people who were working inside of the system, they were complaining that he is basically ruining the institutional structure of the Ukrainian government. And so I think in that respect, it's not only the oligarchic part, but also the institutional part that he ruined to a certain extent. And so now when Ukraine has to respond to the Russian aggression and it has to become more efficient, now he is more willing to listen to the outside advice and to the people who actually want to make change. So he's now making this different sort of union with a different type of people based on different motivation, I would say. So the picture is a lot more mixed, and we still don't know what's going to happen and whether or not Ukraine is going to become a liberal democracy. I think to a large extent it's going to depend on whether or not Ukraine will be able to reform its law enforcement system, first and foremost, because even if we talk about the role of anti-corruption NGOs, yes, they're important, but if you don't have a functioning law enforcement system, they don't really make a change. Very often they only lead to anti-government moods. They lead to depression, to this feeling that nothing is changing, right? But if there is a law enforcement that actually picks up those cases that the anti-corruption NGOs bring up and actually investigates them, and they end up in punishing corrupt officials or weeding out corruption, that's an important thing. And we're seeing a mixed record so far. We've seen real changes in the defense system, in the defense ministry. We're seeing real institutional changes, but at the same time, we have not really seen a change in the recent case when there was SBU following journalists, right? And so we basically saw the usual reaction when people did not get punished for violating the law, but they were dismissed from their positions, but they were still left in the SBU. They were sent to some other parts of the country. And most likely when this wave goes away, then they will be returned. So basically, this is the usual reaction of the system. And so a lot is going to depend on whether or not there's going to be a real change in the law enforcement and security services. And that's going to be an answer on whether Ukraine is going to go to the liberal democracy path. But generally, I think it's a very interesting and very useful approach, but it's not as clear cut when we get to the point after the revolution of dignity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for the comment, and let's just continue with Alexander Etkind's comment.
A great achievement to develop this solid and concise theoretical framework and to apply it symmetrically to antagonistic systems in the time of military conflict, making them both compared, not necessarily comparable, but compared in this consistent, really scholarly way. So it's very challenging, I think, moment for such a work. And I can imagine that you will confront lots of criticism from both sides, because that's war. And you are really, you have you are claiming some kind of neutral territory, probably somewhere above the conflict. It's like a bird view. It's also this kind of language of schemes and concepts, dry language. I think purposefully purified of this sort of militant drives and passions, and I think that's what's very difficult to do it now, and remarkable that you have done it so quickly, and I think very effectively. So I do have some critical remarks, particularly for the Russian side of your comparison of your work, and also I will focus on the political economic aspect of the picture, which I think is could be developed further in the future work or maybe by the future scholars. So Russia is categorized by Magyar and Madlovics as a consolidated patronal autocracy. In this system, the So Patronal already sounds very sort of dry to me. I would really prefer more resonant terms, something like predatory. Or maybe parasitical. So patronal, autocracy. And autocracy, of course, it alludes to the Russian imperial past, like also that subtitle or the actual title of your Russian volume. So autocracy. There is also this old dilemma about authoritarianism versus totalitarianism. You obviously choose this authoritarian side or autocratic side. One could say probably that autocracy is more, a more repressive system than an authoritarian system, but less repressive than totalitarian. So one could say possibly that this autocracy concept claims a middle ground. In this patronal system, the chief patron is the sole decision maker, and all the political system works, is kind of made to work, trained to work, or forced to work for maintaining the patron's power. This patron has unusually large and growing, ever-growing formal competencies. In addition, he shapes the, I quote, unconstrained informal power, particularly over the media and the courts. He doesn't have any accountability before the public, and he doesn't tolerate any political competition. Without competition and feedback, quality of his decisions deteriorate with time. This is largely inevitable. All of us believe that that would happen, right? So this patron is doing everything that a textbook of politics or governance or whatever textbook would say a ruler should not be doing. This patron violates property rights, destroys the court system, increases spendings, deports the intellectual elite, kills the opposition, and finally he starts the war. And combated by his failures, the system avoids responsibilities by delegating even more of them to this leader. Overwhelmed, his office, the leader's office, can do nothing but tightening the screws even tighter, even broader, and with even more centralization. Clearly, this system cannot do it forever, which is a source of hope. However, within this framework, within your framework, there is no way to estimate a threshold on which such a system would implode. So we logically kind of understand that it would, but when? Like, what is the turning point? That remains a question, obviously, very important. But of course, it's important to study the system as it has already been shaped. It's worthwhile to study it even more because there are several such systems in existence, and the study of any such system illuminates the mechanisms of another such system. Say, a study of the Russian system illuminates the mechanisms of the Ukrainian system or of the Hungarian system, or your experience with the Hungarian system helps you to understand the Russian system. So, and though I think that your patronal scheme is still weak for a truly critical study, I fully agree with this book, explicitly monofocused, but implicitly comparative approach. Altogether, this is a very dark picture, comparable to the darkest 20th century dystopias. This system is clearly unsustainable in the long run. But how does it support itself even in the short term, in its day-to-day dealings? That's a question, I think, of political economists rather than to political, like to structural theory. But let's think about it a little bit more. So since we're talking about the real world rather than about polemical novels or dystopias, a big question looms unresolved. How does such a system finance itself? Say in 2022, the budget of the Russian Federation reported the revenue of $341 billion. And its expenses were $2 billion more. So it did need all these billions, a lot of money, roughly a half of the spendings of Pentagon for the same year. With some exceptions, the Russian budget had been growing every year before the last stage of the war started. So it's a huge budget. It has even been growing. And of course, now we know how this huge money were spent on financing the war. But this military spending is another story. Right? It's already the third story that we're discussing. My question is, however, is how do the first two stories, one of Russia's huge and inefficient system of governance, and another of the same country's growing revenue, how do these stories come together? Okay, these two stories are compatible on one and only one condition. The main product of such a country does not depend on the quality of management, on competitiveness, feedback, austerity, human capital, property rights, and other myths and mechanisms of neoliberal governance. Roughly speaking, this product, the main product of such country, should be such a product which could be sold with little or no competition. Such a product which price does not depend on human labor. And such a product which summary value would be enough for covering all the inefficiencies, crimes, and other errors of the ruler. There is such a product in the modern world, and its name is oil. Its sales are based on a monopolistic, or rather oligopolistic, or rather oligopolistic. That's my own neologism. Arrangements. This product is not labor intensive, so that very few, in Russia, just 1% of the population are involved in its extraction and distribution. And since there are very few involved in it, very few can control or just understand what's going on. And of course, oil is a mass product, which sales cover year after year about 2/3 of the Russian budget. So this is my only criticism of this book, of the Russian. It reveals the superstructure of the Russian politics, but tends to ignore the basis of the Russian economy. However, the basis is essential, and omitting it is pretty sad. You cannot imagine Putin's Russia to make its huge income by producing cars like Slovakia or ships like Taiwan. You can imagine it, and you know it as is, only as an oil and gas-based economy, a petro state. And I think this is kind of this fact, which is no discovery whatsoever, but this truism is underrepresented in your book. To give one example, the word oil is used in your book less frequently than the word trade by the factor of 3. And it is rarer than the word power by the factor of 6. But it is oil that is the main article of the Russian trade. It is oil that gives power to those few who own it and strips freedom and autonomy from those who do not. Have Putin-shaped oil, or oil-shaped Putin? I'm afraid that today the answer is more obvious than ever.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander, for the comments. So I would give you the floor for a first round of response.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the comments. First, I have to emphasize that our analysis has 3 layers. First is the regime-specific features. Second, the country-specific features. And the third is the policy-specific features. Our big book about the anatomy of post-communist regimes concentrates on the regime-specific features because this is what we think the most important one. And of course, even different countries which can be put in the same category concerning their regimes, for example, Hungary and Russia, and Central Asian countries as patronal autocracies and post-communist mafia states, of course, if we are looking for the country-specific features, there are huge differences. This is, for example, what you mentioned, that what is the real importance of natural resources in maintaining an autocratic regime. Of course, in Russia, it's easier in that sense that they have oil, gas, and other natural resources. In the case of Hungary, as we do not have these things, our oil reserves and gas reserves, these are the EU funds. But structurally, they have the same functions on maintaining an autocratic regime. And what we really meant, and what was our primary goal, is just creating a language, and a structured language. With the help of such a language, anybody could tell his own story, resembling much more to the reality than with another language which is used for the description of liberal democracies. The problem what we had to face, that if we want to tell our story with these categories, illiberal democracy, hybrid regimes, etc., it does not say anything about us. We used to have the example that if we go into a zoo and stand in front of an elephant, and the mainstream literature says that it's an illiberal fish, it does not mean too much if we want to know that what are the real features of an elephant. The other thing, I would go there and to show one slide which refers to your question about the relation between the mafia state and the patronal autocracy. And if we go there, this is the if we concentrate on the case of patronal autocracy, which is the regime type, and of course the patronal autocracies are operating. They are operating mafia state as a state. That we should be able to call a state mafia state, it has to fulfill at least 4 major conditions. And the first is that who is the actor? We have to answer that question. And the actors are not a neo-feudal order, it's not a neo-nomenklatura, it's not a class, it's a kind of clan, an extended form of a patriarchal family, where families are incorporated, and this so-called adopted political family, you have formal and informal positions mixed together. It has a clan structure. The term clan state was used primarily for the states, Central Asian republics, where the nucleus of these clans were ethnic based. But in the case of Russia, for such clans has other origins, middle-level KGB guys and then guys from St. Petersburg municipality. In Hungary, the nucleus of this clan, these are some dormitory rooms in a fraternity house in the university, in the case of Orban. But notion of the whole thing is very similar structurally, that families are adopted. For an adopted political family, there is no free entrance and free exit. You must have adoption, and you must be either ousted there or dismissed or sent into pension, etc., in quotation marks, something like that. But the main structure which glues together these actors, this is the loyalty towards the chief patron. The second is if we examine what is the relation of the state to the power, to the public authorities, and if it fulfills the condition that there is a private expropriation of public authorities, then it's a patrimonial or neo-patrimonial state. If we are thinking about public goods and even private goods, we can say that it's not only a rent-seeking state or a kleptocratic, but a predatory state. And between kleptocratic state and predatory state, there is big difference because in spite of the fact that both of them are criminal actions, but to be kleptocratic, it's a peaceful one, targeting incomes and revenues practically, while in the case of predatory state, it targets private properties, taking away other private properties or state properties. So we call it a center-led corporate trading, what is done by a criminal organization, which is the state itself. And finally, we should not say that it's just a corrupt state or a state captured, which means that some oligarchy groups or criminal organizations are capturing this or that part of the state, but the state as a whole is operated as a criminal organization. And if these four conditions are fulfilled, then of course, then we can call it a mafia state. But to create a mafia state, the first condition is on the political sphere that you should have the monopoly of political power. And this happened in Hungary, mainly because of the disproportionate election system, that one single political force would seize the political power and practically control the legislation, the executive power, judiciary system, etc. And of course, it was much more easy for Russia and Central Asian countries, which were originally presidential states, presidential systems. So, of course, without such an autocratic breakthrough with which you can seize the monopoly of political power, you cannot build up a single pyramid patronal network. Therefore, we think that patronalism and patronal network is the most important categorical underlying condition and description for these regimes. And of course, if you have a single pyramid patronal network, then it's much more easy to tell your story with the help of these categories. And at the same time, it means that, of course, in post-communist regimes, there are different trajectories. We make a difference just separating these two levels of approach. One is for the political dimension, and other is for the patronal or non-patronal dimension, which means we separated or made differences between four such basic primary trajectories when countries went from communist dictatorship directly to liberal democracies, which meant that practically from a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal system to a multi-pyramid non-patronal system. But for example, in the case of Ukraine, it was from a single pyramid bureaucratic patronal to a multi-pyramid informal patronal system, while it became from a communist dictatorship patronal democracy. But those countries, mainly Kazakhstan, Central Asian countries, and Russia, from a dictatorship to an autocracy. And of course, they remain single pyramid system, but the previous one, bureaucratic one, and the other is informal one. But in the case of Russia, of course, since the war is going from a patronal autocracy, started to go towards a dictatorship. And of course, it's also such an important question, how could we describe this new path of Russia was going on directly to a dictatorship?
Okay, just some three very quick comments. First of all, thank you for your comments, and thank you for actually reading the book and working on it. I know these are 2 volumes and many studies, but I still hope they are quite readable. Just 3 very short comments. First, you mentioned that we didn't really deal with how these patronal autocracies fall down, and it really is a dark picture that we are drawing, because based on our model, it is really like that a consolidated patronal autocracy is almost impossible to break down. Well, it is in fact possible to break it down. And in our big book, The Anatomy of Post-Communist Regimes, or the short version of it, The Concise Field Guide to Post-Communist Regimes, we, for example, deal with the problem of succession and how that can create a change or a turning point within such a system. However, now with these two volumes, we just wanted to focus on the structural consequences of the war. And breaking down the Russian system, as we just heard from Bálint, is not one of the consequences of the war in Russia. Rather, it is going from a patronal autocracy in a direction of a more oppressive, more open, from informal to more semi-formal, or even more formalized dictatorship. So that's the first one. The second one is about oil and the oil reserves. In this book, in the two volumes, we actually try to reflect on it a little bit, even though not as fundamentally, because as Bálint said, we were mainly interested in the regime-specific features. We were interested in this triangle. We were interested in how, because basically what really dynamized the Ukrainian political system for 30 years, these were the patronal networks. And the question is now how this is changing and how practically the whole political economic system is changing. If you want to answer that, then you have to focus on the regime-specific features that we did and the oligarchic structures and how it is moving from patronal democracy in what kind of directions. But there are actually two studies that are reflecting on the question of energy. First, also in the first one, the other in the second one, from two sides, from the side of Russia and from the side of Ukraine. In the second volume, there is a study about sanctions. It's written by a Hungarian economist, Dóra Györfi. And in her study, she actually uses the term neo-backwardness for the Russian situation. What is emerging now with all the sanctions cutting off Russia from key markets, and how it is trying to cope with that, and how it creates a kind of crisis within Russia that is unlike the cyclical crisis of capitalist economies. So, and that of course involves, to a large degree, the question of selling or able to sell the energy as well on the world market. So that's the thing from the side of Russia. In the first volume, there is a study by Dmytro Tuzansky. And Dmytro Tuzansky analyzed the question of energy from the perspective of Ukraine, especially because what he argues is that even though these regime-specific features, and even my presentation, mainly focused on the domestic informal patronal network, domestic adapted political families competing against each other in the guise of parties. In fact, what Tuzansky says is that there is a kind of super patron above them, and that was Russia. That was Russia in the sense that because Putin supported energy, he also had a kind of direct influence on Ukrainian politics, on at least some patronal networks, mainly Medvedchuk's network. He was rather very much influential on it, but also practically because Ukraine was so much dependent on energy, and it was a transmission country for it also towards the more Western countries. It created a kind of situation that is now also changing as the war is going on, and Ukraine is actually trying to make itself independent in that regard as well, and how that is described, how this kind of political economic system of Ukraine is making itself more independent from that kind of influence as well. And the final point, and now I'd like to answer Julia's point, that indeed we can see that, of course, this is a model that we are presenting. This is a model of patronal democracy and patronal autocracy. And as a model, or if I want to speak in the language of sociology, these are ideotypes. And of course, an ideotype always has some degree of simplification because it focuses on the key features. It focuses on those features that define the dynamics of all these regimes. But what we believe is that these are, in fact, what we are presenting. These are not simplifications of reality, but they make the understanding of reality simpler. And that is a great difference between the two. Thank you.
So I I'm not at all like very familiar with the concepts you're using and the literature you're basing this in. So it was very interesting for me and sort of to think about this, especially this concept of patronal democracy. And so it was also interesting to see this exchange, which seems to be a kind of a question about whether, you know, this more established literature on the resource curves and the kind of the question of the economic basis of this of these kinds of regimes is somehow more fundamental than the network properties that you can describe. And I suppose like the question would be like how many non resource curses for how many non resource curses you can demonstrate that these properties actually exist, so that the comparative poverty is large enough to make a good case. I mean, it's a very innovative way to think about Hungary as a sort of, you know, being able to have its oil kind of through the European Union. But of course, these are very, very different kind of mechanisms through which the Hungarian state can actually access these resources as compared to an oil. So I would just be curious if you could develop that a little bit further. And when it comes to these two case studies, and now in the context of the war, so like the interesting thing is like what you say is that in both cases actually the category of the patronal democracy is disappearing, or it is kind of in the or like patronal autocracy. In one case it develops away in one direction, the other it develops away in the other direction, which of course then raises this question of whether ultimately you know, what you are criticizing could be brought back to you to say like, aren't those ultimately intermediate kind of hybrid features that if under certain circumstances they will kind of be pushed one way or the other. So in other words, the question is like, how systemic is a patronal democracy, and what how Alexander used the term sustainable, also like how, you know, how much of this is actually, what is actually the difference between a liberal democracy and what makes a patronal democracy kind of stable, so to speak. I'm simply out of curiosity. So
let me try to answer for your last question. What makes a patronal democracy stable? Or on one side, you have to understand why they do not become patronal autocracies. And there are two major institutional constraints in this way. One is the proportionate election system. The second is the divided executive power. So as Bálint in his presentation told that just wanting to concentrate power and to build up a single pyramid patronal network, it's a norm in these patronal democracies, but these are the major institutional constraints. In the case of Hungary, and this is our tragedy in this sense, that we had a very disproportionate election system, which meant that when we had political, economic, and to some extent moral collapse in 2009, 2010, then the Fidesz as a single political force with the 53% of the votes, they got 67% of the seats in the parliament. When they had this is the constitutional supermajority what they reached, they unilaterally changed the constitution and the election law. Since that time, in 6, 7, 8 waves, about 300 places of the law, always half year, 1 year before the elections, as it was needed. Next elections in 2014, they had only, I mean in quotation mark, 44% of the votes, but they still had 67% of the seats. So they made this election system even more disproportionate. While in other countries, I think that Romania, Slovakia, Serbia, Bulgaria would be the same patronal autocracy if they would have such a disproportionate election system what we had, but because it's not a matter that whether it's a left-wing party or right-wing party, Basescu or Ponta in Romania, they would build up such a single pyramid patronal network. And the other thing is this divided executive power. practically we have a president in the country not directly elected, but by the majority of the parliament. It's just a puppet of the prime minister in such a system. While in other patronal autocracies like Russia and Central Asian countries, they are presidential systems. And from a presidential position, it was much more easy to build out such an autocratic regime. Even in Central Asian countries, the former chief party cadres and chief KGB cadres became the new autocrats of these regimes. So this is why we see that in spite of the fact that there is a huge tension between the constitutional set of a country, which resembles very much to the Western societies, on the other hand, the stubborn structures, what we wanted to describe, not just euphemistically with stubborn structures only, but somehow defined. And this is why we use the term of Henry as patronalism and wanted to separate it in subcategories. That what does it mean exactly? This creates this cyclical character of these regimes. The question is that how large is the amplitude of these cycles in these countries? In Ukraine was the biggest one. Because of the two-color revolution needed to turn it back. In Moldova, it was a less narrower, while in Bulgaria or in Romania or in Slovakia, this cycle has a much smaller amplitude. So it gives at the same time an insecurity of this regime type, a permanent move, but at the same time they are unable to go towards the direction of liberal democracies and towards the direction of patronal autocracies as well. But if you once have a patronal autocracy, and this is bad news for Hungary, that I think that that in Hungary now you cannot win or cannot defeat the government or this regime through elections, because again, turning back to the language, what is used by the mainstream Western literature, that the elections can be free but not fair. You know, it does not describe the situation in Hungary, because it's something like that before a run race, you cut one of the legs of the runners, competitors, and you say, okay, he has the right to be a part of the competition with one leg. Yes, so he is free to run, while it's not exactly fair that he only with one leg. No, this is the discussion. In Hungary, you practically cannot win. And this is the case especially even much more in Russia, where they either physically or administratively liquidate any potential competitors on the so-called elections. So it's a bad news for us, and in a patronal autocracy, what makes the difference between the Polish and Hungarian one, Polish autocratic attempt at the Hungarian autocratic regime, that Kaczynski was an autocrat but not a criminal. He did not patronize the regime, he's not a criminal. In Hungary, Orban is an autocrat and a criminal at the same time. The regime is a criminal regime, and therefore the stakes of the elections are absolutely different from those what were the stakes of the elections, for example, in Poland, because there, what would happen that Kaczynski, from a leading position, he became in an opposition position, while in Hungary is the question that whether Orban is an omnipotent, or he or his family could be a target of judicial process, and treated as a criminal, what he is according to the existing Hungarian criminal code. And this is what makes these autocratic regimes very dangerous, because all these autocrats knows that while, of course, their clients there has no or have no free exit from this patron client network, for them also there is no free exit. Because if Putin knows and Orban knows also what happened with Yanukovych, what happened with Moldova with Plahotniuc, what happened with Gruevski in North Macedonia, where the Hungarian Secret Service had to escape for Gruevski to Hungary, and for the others autocrats. They do not have a solid and safe way to resign from this autocratic position.
So just because Bálint already started mentioning it, I would like to show you something, and I will go. We actually have a website. It's postcommunistregimes.com. There you can find these two books that we are talking about today. They are open access, as I said. Actually, they are now being translated to Ukrainian and Russian. and they will be published very soon, and they will also be open access. And on this website, you can also find an interactive, I hope it works, yes, an interactive version of this triangular model that we have. So in this model, I just want to show you, and this, as I said, it's also on the website. This tool, on the one hand, is important for being able to compare, for example, various trajectories. So if you just put there Ukraine's trajectory with blue and Russia's trajectories with red, you can see immediately the difference, that Ukraine's trajectory, still Ukraine moved around patronal democracy, and now the question, of course, is in which direction it is going to go. But in the case of Russia, it is seemingly much more clearer that it is actually going towards a kind of dictatorship from patronal autocracy. Now, as Bálint mentioned, two countries now, one of them being Hungary, and Hungary also has a long regime trajectory, just very, it is difficult to, this one. And also we mentioned Poland, which has a shorter regime trajectory. Let me just take out the dates. So if I do this with the triangle, now here I return to mainstream political science. This is what mainstream hybridology offers. They offer you that here's Hungary and there is Poland, Kaczynski's Poland, of course, I was referring to that under this autocratic attempt. And what they are saying is, if you look at these comparisons of Orbán and Kaczynski, what they will say is that, oh yes, Orbán is more autocratic, his autocracy is more developed because he has more power, but Kaczynski was also catching up, and practically he was on the same road, that he was doing the same project with less power. But both of them are similar, they are the two black sheep of the EU, and because they are moving from the liberal democratic ideal towards an authoritarian regime, towards dictatorship, on this single democracy dictatorship axis. However, if we go back to the triangle, we can immediately see the great difference between these two regimes, between a conservative autocratic attempt and between a patronal autocracy. This is why the language is so important. And this is why we say that it is not enough to just focus, and this is probably the bottom line of all the work that we do, is that you have to have a language which actually reflects on the reality of these systems, that actually reflects on, first and foremost, on the patronal character of these regimes. Because if you do not understand patronism, if you do not see below the surface what really dynamizes these systems, then you won't be able to understand Ukraine and Russia either, and you won't be able to understand what kind of processes have started now with the Russia-Ukraine war in these two countries.
The last question that I would have would be on the question of the civil society mobilization that you mentioned in terms of the sort of role it plays, especially here in the Ukrainian case. But if you relate it to your model, it seems like that this is given a significant sort of role in potentially changing the trajectory, right? So it seems like that, if I understand that well, like that this is kind of meant to be a challenge to, especially to the patronal basis of these models that has to occur for a trajectory to shift. And so I'm wondering whether that is a correct description in a way, or and then again, like, you know, how, like, wouldn't that, like, because that doesn't really, at least as far as I can see, like that, isn't that the missing piece in those countries where we don't see such a change, like when it comes for, like, let's say the Russian.
Yes. So here you see patronal democracy and patronal autocracy. And what you are asking, that in a patronal democracy, there are competing patronal networks. Of course, those who are in government, they are stronger, and the other patronal networks are weaker than those who are in power now. But at the same time, because of this rivalry, that none of them is in the position to monopolize the political power, therefore there is a place for independent organizations as well. Not only just for such organizations which are tied to this or to that patronal network, but some others. And this happened in the case of Ukraine as well, or this is the case in Romania and other cases, that therefore these societies, patronal democracies, of course, more democratic in that sense that there are a bigger space for autonomous organizations than in a patronal autocracy, where in the case of patronal autocracy, you see in this sense, there is a single pyramid patronal network, and most of these sub-networks are incorporated in this patronal one, and there are only very few and very small part of these which are outside. And of course, if it's going towards a dictatorship or even more autocratic regime, then the possibility for independent organizations smaller. For example, from 2015 until 2020 or something like that, I visited several times Russia. I had lectures at the International Memorial twice, at the Sakharov Center, at the Yeltsin Center, European University. All of these are practically forbidden and closed for the tightened and more stronger autocracy, which was before, and some others. It's not the case in these countries where you have patronal democracies.
I would like to ask you if you think that Hungary is heading toward a dictatorship.
It's an autocracy, and even in the case when we compared it with Russia, if we thought of the structure of the ruling elite, there were some major differences. One is that the oligarchic pillar of that ruling elite was much weaker than in Hungary, for example, and there had in Russia another pillar, the so-called Siloviki, which was based in the FSB and other security forces, military, etc., etc. Now, during the war, ironically, we could say that the deregulation was replaced by defenestration. So, in the case of oligarchs, so they fall out of the windows, So practically, they became pushed in a trap. Their foreign property was sanctioned and of course restricted their use, their property at home as well. So that pillar practically collapsed, and now the ruling elite is much more within the formal institutions. In the case of Hungary, it's the importance as autonomous decision makers. The Secret Service has nothing to do. They are subordinated totally to the chief patron Orban and his strong oligarchic structures. It does not need and does not have the possibility to become a dictatorship. Concerning that mass terror, detaining a lot of people because of political reasons. The ways of suppression in Hungary, I used to say, with an analogy from wrestling, it's a kind of chokehold. That if you do not move, then you can brace. If you start to move, you cannot brace. And therefore, the existential type of dependencies is much wider. They can easily destroy the existential base of different enterprises, persons, and so on. And the glue within this patronal network, the single pyramid patronal network, that to be a criminal, it's a condition to belong to that. Otherwise, you cannot be blackmailed. You cannot be tied directly to this patron client network. So the power practically compromises most of its clients in such a way that, according to the Hungarian existing criminal code, they are committing some crimes, economic crimes, I mean, and such a way it's a relatively stable system.
Then let's conclude and thank everybody very much, our two editors and our discussants. Thank you, Julia, to you for your comment and joining us today online, and thank you to everybody in the audience for coming. And there's a small reception behind there for everybody. Thank you very much.